Hello and welcome back to the Hazzabhajan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today it is time for the second episode of the Random League Generator series, which I started last week with the Central African Republic. If you missed that episode, a link to it is in the description, as well as the players for this particular series, which I'm going to christen Nation Roulette. As I intimated last week in the episode, our next stop is the country which has brought us drug cartels, gang violence, and, definitely most importantly of all, Shakira. That nation, in case you hadn't figured it out by now, is the beautiful land of Colombia. Located in South America, it is the country that borders the southernmost Central American nation in Panama, meaning that it is the mediator between the two continents. It also shares a border with Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela. But you aren't interested in the geography of the country, and if you are, then go and find another video on this topic, because this video is not the one for you. Although continue watching anyway, and please do subscribe if you haven't done so while you're at it. Instead, I'm sure because you clicked on this video, you're interested in its footballing heritage. So what I'm going to do is cover the national team and the league to an extent, although there were two incidents during this time which I did actually want to cover in separate videos, but as a result of Colombia being drawn in that random league generator site which I found online, therefore it meant that I could cover them in this video. So I guess I'm killing three stones with one bird. Although Independiente Medellin was founded in 1913 and a league known to exist in 1918, clubs were most confined to two regions, those being Bogota and Barranquilla, and they didn't develop sufficiently to be able to cope with the demands of professional football until the 1930s. It was at this time that the demand for Colombian coffee started to grow around the world, and nearly 80% of the country's export income was dependent on the stuff. But as a result of this, the economy boomed, railways were built, and industrialization took place. And Football League, as a result of this, was now able to be established. However, for its first 5 years, it would be unlike any seen before in the game. In 1948, the Barranquilla-based amateur league, AD Football, was joined by a professional Bogota-centered division in Di Mayor. But after an assassination of a politician whose desire for change in people power had led him to become the overwhelming favourite for the upcoming 1949 election just before his murder, Bogota's people rioted, meaning that the start of the Di Mayor League was suspended for a few months. In the ensuing riots that were to follow in the aftermath of that assassination, over 200,000 people were killed. The league began in August 1948 with 32 foreign players amongst its 10 sides. It is important to note that statistic for later, as well as some foreign match officials brought in to help improve the standard of match officials in Colombia. Although not much attention in the press was granted to it during its inception, it grew and grew as the season progressed, which was won in the end by Santa Fe. In this time, AD Football and Di Mayor were feuding, and the former requested the FIFA suspend the latter, after, perhaps understandably so, disagreeing over payment issues. FIFA obliged, and the Di Mayor League was suspended from FIFA in 1949. However, Alfonso Senor Quevedo, president of Millonarios in the Bogota League, realised that, as a result of this, they were exempt from FIFA regulations over aspects like number of foreign players in their squad, transfer fees, and wages. At this time, too, Argentinian players were striking in their droves over payment issues, as their demands of freedom of contract and the creation of a minimum wage went unnoticed by the Argentinian football authorities. With this in mind, Senor instructed his manager, Carlos Aldeibe, to go to Argentina and buy a star man, knowing full well that they wouldn't have to pay a transfer fee as a result of them being excluded from FIFA, so a lot of cash would be left over for signing on fees and player wages. The resulting player Aldeibe brought back was Adolfo Pedernera, one of River Plate's famed La Máquina side of the 1940s, which dominated the Argentinian game, and one of the best players in the world at the time. This was huge. His presentation brought in $18,000 to the club, 5 times more than the general income made from a match, let alone for a presentation. This was undoubtedly a watershed moment for the league, as his quality shone through in a league of players whose quality wasn't in any way close to that of Pedernera. As such, he was told to return to Argentina and find the club some more talent, which he did in the forms of Nestor Rossi and one Alfredo Di Stefano, whose eventual transfer to Real Madrid, as a result of his move to Millonarios, would be unlike any the game has ever seen before or since. I have covered it in a previous video, which you can check out in the description if you haven't done so already. The club were, perhaps understandably, the dominant force of the Colombian game, winning 4 out of 5 titles between 1949 and 1953, and Di Stefano described the team as liberated and lavish in terms of its lifestyles, something which they had yearned for in their homeland but never received. The club were nicknamed the Ballet Azul, or the Blue Ballet for English speakers, because blue was the colour of their kit, and the ballet was as a result of their incredible football that they played. For example, during one 10-game stretch, they hit 5 goals in each and every one of them, but stopped at 5 goals so as not to humiliate their opponents even more. Once, a player had the temerity to score a 6th goal in a match and his teammates were furious, although he simply wanted the prized hat that the club were offering to the player who scored the last goal at the end of the game. At the 5th goal, they would prioritise the spectacle for the fans over the actual goals, and they would pass the ball around with such speed and efficiency that it left the opponents dizzy, and sometimes they even stood and simply watched. However, these other clubs, seeing the wealthy team of the Conservatives succeeding, wanted a piece of the action too, and they didn't restrict themselves to just buying players from Argentina. Cúcuta Deportivo would be home to many of the members from the Uruguay 1950 World Cup winning squad, including Schubert Gambetta, what a name that is by the way. Atletico Junior brought in no fewer than 5 Hungarians in spite of their expulsion from the league after playing in Brazil, something which D Mayor clubs, as a result of their expulsion in FIFA, weren't actually allowed to do. Independiente Medellin brought Peruvians, and Deportes Caldas even welcomed the Lithuanian goalkeeper Vytautas Kasciunas to their ranks. Think of it as the 1950s equivalent of the Chinese Super League, but with fewer restrictions and rules, and no higher power watching over them. The most high-profile club besides Millonarios was Independiente Santa Fe, who played in a red kit inspired by Arsenal's own red kit, but as it was also the colour of the Colombian Liberal Party, it kick-started a long-standing rivalry between the two clubs, Millonarios, of course, being mostly conservative siding. Santa Fe was set up by the Cambridge-educated Luis Robledo, who corresponded with some of England's highest-profile footballers of the time to bring them over to Colombia, promising a lavish lifestyle, endless hot weather, and relative freedom. Charlie Mitten would arrive from Manchester United and George Mountford from Stoke, but the most surprising and game-changing arrival of all was Neil Franklin from the Potters. Widely considered to be England's best centre-back at the time, Franklin was tired of Stoke's insistence of keeping him on their books, despite barely playing him. And when he heard the freedom that the Colombian League offered, he jumped at the chance to sign for Independiente Santa Fe. His signing fee was reported to be anywhere in the region of £1,500 to £10,000, with Stanley Matthews claiming it to be £3,400 and Mitten £5,000. For a bit of context, the maximum sign-on fee a player in England could receive at the time was a meagre £10. Clearly, there was a huge financial difference in play. However, despite the promises, they arrived in a country engulfed in civil war which spawned from the riots of 1948, as well as the election of a president, Laureano Gomez, who suspended civil liberties. The insurrection, spurred on by the Liberal Party, was counteracted with brutal governmental oppression, and 200,000 people would go on to lose their lives in the next 3 years. Franklin himself noted that there were demonstrations almost every single day, and football was subsequently used as the distraction policy from all the violence. Furthermore, as a result of poor training facilities and regimes, low standard of play, and altitude sickness combined with Franklin's wife's pregnancy and son's illness at the time, plus the constant violence, thefts, and kidnappings that plagued the nation, the British expats soon realised that life was not all what it seemed, and they returned back to Blighty with tails firmly between their legs within a year. Amongst all of this, the league realised that they couldn't continue in this vein for much longer, and FIFA sent officials to Bogota to negotiate an end to this golden age of El Dorado. In 1951, a monumental congress was held in Lima, and Colombia were allowed to be re-affiliated to FIFA, meaning that the league and its policies would have to come to an end, although FIFA allowed them to continue until 1953, and the ban on playing foreign clubs was immediately lifted. Millonarios, as a result of this, set off on a world tour in 1952, before winning the last title of the El Dorado era in 1953. After this, the foreign players, whose number reached a zenith of 283 out of the 430 registered players in the Colombian League in 1951, would return to their separate home countries or would move to Europe. Obviously, this had the side effect of a lack of development for Colombian footballers, as most were overshadowed by their foreign counterparts, and only 2 from this time, Francisco Zualaga and Efrain Sanchez, emerged as genuinely class talents from this time. Perhaps it is little wonder that Colombia only managed to qualify for 1 World Cup before 1990. As is always the case when a halcyon age is reached, such as with Sir Alex Ferguson at Manchester United, the come down when it departs is always the most troublesome, and so it proved for the Colombian League. The economy suffered as a result of the uprising in the early 50s, and coffee exports dried up significantly too, as its global value decreased. As such, the league's quality was extremely low, and they barely made any waves in continental competition for the next 2 to 3 decades. The national team, undeniably in tandem with the league's fortunes, also suffered a similar fate, as although they qualified for the World Cup in 1962, they didn't make any waves in the Copa America until 1975, when they finished second, mostly being the whipping boys of the competition whenever they entered, and even needing to withdraw from some competitions, potentially as a result of financial problems within the country. They even had to withdraw from hosting the 1986 World Cup after lacking the economic backbone to host the 2014 World Cup. having been given the rights with an assumption that it would be a 16-team tournament. The formal economy wasn't working for Colombian football, so they turned to the informal economy of drug cartels to keep the club solvent, and it worked. But not only did it work, but it had transformed the quality of Colombian football. During the 1980s, their teams reached 5 Copa Libertadores finals in a row, with America de Cali, powered by the drug lord Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, reaching 3 in a row, albeit they lost all of them. And foreign players returned to the Colombian league en masse for the first time since that El Dorado era in the 1950s. It was reported that 17 of the 20 clubs in the league had some association to drug cartels, but none, however, were more prominent than the role played by Pablo Escobar. One of the world's most infamous drug lords, Escobar had an incredible fervour for the beautiful game, playing himself as a left winger. His passion was such that, alongside his myriad of purchases of cars and houses with the drug money that he obtained, he spent millions on football pitches and floodlights, as well as other vital pieces of equipment like kits, helping the football world in Colombia to develop sufficiently. He even staged private matches with bets of $1 million or more involving fantasy 11s of his own, or others, playing against each other. It reached a point where he started pouring money into Atlético Nacional, and although he wasn't officially registered as part of a club, everyone knew that he was, in all but name. Nacional, with Escobar's support, won the 1989 Copa Libertadores final on penalties, and they didn't even need the help of a bribed referee, as Escobar tried to bribe him before the second leg. Bear in mind Nacional lost the first leg 2-0, but the ref stoically refused. As you can probably tell, the Colombian footballing climate was booming, but let's just ignore the growth in violence and football-related hooliganism, which resulted in thousands of deaths, including 20 in the aftermath of Nacional's Copa Libertadores triumph, and one, the referee Alvaro Ortega, who was murdered on Escobar's orders after being supposedly bribed by America de Cali during a game against Escobar's other team, Deportivo Independiente Medellin. Riding the crest of this footballing wave, the national team qualified for the 1990 World Cup and put up a decent showing, going out in the second round to Cameroon, but expectations were high for the 1994 World Cup, with Pelé, for one, backing them to go all the way. However, they would lose their opening 2 games and go out of the group stages, and the final blow was dealt by one of their own, after Andres Escobar, no relation to Pablo, scored an own goal against the USA to knock Colombia out of the tournament. Upon his return, he became one of many gunned down in seemingly ceaseless violence within the country, where the murder rate stood at 10 times that of the US during the 90s. As he was murdered, the assailant simply shouted, "Gol." Pablo himself wouldn't see that tournament, as he was murdered in December 1993, whilst, allegedly, wearing football boots. They qualified in 1998, with Carlos Valderrama, the country's leading appearance maker, dragging the side to the tournament, but they put in a pitiful performance and went out in the group stages once again, and 3 Colombian clubs would lose the final of the Copa Libertadores in the mid to late 1990s. The violence and instability was such that the Colombia were actually barred from hosting the 2001 Copa America. Although after numerous confirmations that they would be alright and that the violence would dissipate, they were eventually reinstated, albeit at the cost of Argentine and Canadian participation, as both nations withdrew, not willing to take the risk. Mercifully, there was a ceasefire during the tournament and Colombia won their first major honour, although it would prove to be a temporary ceasefire and regrettably not a permanent one. They didn't qualify for the next 3 World Cups, murders continued at a high rate, the football teams lost funds and the quality diminished. Whispers began in the early 2010s, however, that Colombia were on the verge of a golden generation, and so it proved, as the dark horse at the 2014 World Cup, spearheaded by James Rodriguez and the country's all-time top scorer Radamel Falcao, were unfortunately knocked out by Brazil in the quarterfinals. I mean, they probably would have done a better job against Germany. However, they struggled in future tournaments, barring a 3rd place finish in 2016's Copa Centenario, and were knocked out by England on penalties in 2018. Their league, up until 2002, consisted of just one straight football season, but from that year, it was changed to an apertura for the first half of the season and a finalización for the second. Each would see the teams play each other once before the top 8 teams advanced to the semi-finals, where they would be split into 2 groups of 4, with the winners of those groups playing each other in the final. The aggregate table over those seasons would be used to determine Copa Libertadores places, and relegation would be judged as to their previous 3 seasons on a points per game basis. From 2019, there would be an extra game to the season, where each team would play their closest rivals for a second time, potentially as a result of extra ticket revenue, or to make things more fair, considering the hostilities that some clubs have towards their bitter rivals. The most successful of all are Escobar's beloved Atlético Nacional with 16 titles, and alongside Millonarios and Independiente Santa Fe, they are one of only 3 teams who have never been relegated from Colombia's top flight. In 2019, the finalización was won by America de Cali, winning their 14th title overall, making them, understandably, one of the other powerhouses of the Colombian game. In the 2017 season too, only 13 of the players in the league were foreign, a far cry from the 283 out of 430 back in 1951, during that golden El Dorado era. that just about concludes today's video. Thank you very, very much for watching or listening, depending on what you did with this video. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it or found it interesting. Subscribe if you haven't done so already, and comment down below with what you think of the whole situation, I guess. Thank you very, very much for watching, as I say, and until next time, I'll see you then.